Okay, if you have your Bibles, grab them. Okay, if you have your Bibles, why don't you grab them? Well, if you have your Bibles, grab them. Okay, if you have your Bibles, let's go. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and grab them. Well, if you have your Bibles, grab them. Habakkuk. Well, good evening. How are you? Well, good evening. If you have your Bibles, let's grab them. Okay, if you have your Bibles, Ephesians chapter 5. Okay, if you have your Bibles, Hebrews chapter 13. If you have your Bibles, grab them. Okay, if you have your Bibles, Matthew chapter. If you have your Bibles, will you grab them? Okay, if you have your Bibles, grab them. Okay, let's get to work. Good morning. If you have your Bibles, let's start in Psalm 1. Well, good evening. If you have your Bibles, let's go Colossians. If you have your Bibles, why don't you grab them? If you have your Bibles, why don't you grab them? Good morning. If you have your Bibles, let's go to Colossians. Good evening. If you have your Bibles, let's go to. Good morning. How are you? Okay. Good morning. How are we? Okay. I literally have 4 minutes to solve a problem that's been around for 2 centuries. So, good morning. How are you? All right. If you have your Bibles, grab them. How are you? If you have your Bibles, grab them. Hi. How are we? Hey. How are you? If you have your Bibles, let's grab them. Okay. If you have your Bibles, grab them. Hey. How are we? Okay. Excellent. Let's grab your Bibles. We'll be in. Okay. If you have your Bibles, let's grab them. All right. If you have your Bibles, grab them. How are we? Okay, Colossians. Hey, how are we? All right, let's get to work. All right, Colossians chapter. All right, how are we? Good? Hey, how are we? We good? Hey, how are we? Good? Hey, how are we? Good? Hey, Mark chapter 2. How are we? Let's go Ephesians. Hey, how are we? How are we? Okay, let's get to. How are we? Hey, grab your Bibles. John. Okay, let's get to work. Ephesians. Okay, let's get to work. All right, let's get to work. How are we? Let's get going. Hey, if you have your Bibles, let's go. Let's do some work here. How's everybody doing? We good? How are we? Nope. How are we? We good? Oh, it's going to be like that. All right. I don't know that I... How are we? We good? Okay, Luke 18. All right, how are we? We good? Okay.
Hi, this is Matt Chandler. I'm the lead pastor, teaching pastor.
Hey, how are we? We good? Hey, how are we? Okay, let's go. How are we? Okay, let's get to work. Second. Hey, how are we? How are we? Good? How are we? Good? I'm going to read this and then I want to celebrate. How are we? Okay, let's. Hey, how are we? We good? How are we? We good? How are we? We good? Okay, let's get started first. Okay, Ephesians. How are we? We good? Good morning. If you have your Bible. How are we? We good? Okay, go to first. How are we? Okay, Genesis 20. Hey, how are we? We good? Okay, Deuteronomy. How are we? Merry Christmas. How are we? All right, let's. How are we? All right, let's get to work. Luke 7. Hey, how are we? It's a little loud there. How are we? Happy Thanksgiving. All right, let's get to work. How are we? About 20. Luke 14. How are we? We good? We all right? Okay, let's get going. Not a. How are we? We good? Luke. How are we? Okay, 3 of you are excellent. How are we? Oh, okay. Well, let's get going. Acts chapter 8, but I tend to, for the... Hey, how are we? All right. Hey, you can go ahead and have a seat. If you have your Bibles, let's get going. Luke, let's go. Luke chapter 7. How are we doing this morning, okay? If you have your Bibles, grab them. How are we? We good? How are we? How are we? If you have your Bibles, let's grab them. It's good to see you. You look good. Hey, how are we? Let's go, Luke. The weekend services here. How are we? How are we? All right, let's. Luke chapter 4. Hey, how are we? All right, let's go. Hey, how are we? You look good in your Christmas shirts. I love this time of year. If you have your Bibles, let's go Matthew 13. Luke chapter 2. It's an interesting story. Hey, how are we? All right. Luke chapter. Hey, how are we? If you've got your Bibles, we're going to start in Luke chapter 1. Let me just. How are we? All right. How are we? We good? I love you. Thanks for coming.